At GalaxyCon in Raleigh in 2022, which just happened as of this recording, I was asked by one of the attendees to list, I believe, 100 science fiction books that were my favorite or were most influential or most important. Obviously, I can't do that because I don't have that kind of time, but I do have time to help you with a few which you probably should read. First, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss some of the most influential early science fiction works. Then we're going to go into some influential 20th century science fiction works, mid-20th century science fiction works, and then from there, we're going to talk about a few which are artistically wonderful and you should read, as well as a couple which are really just fun. So, my name is Joseph Cadott. This is Ill-Informed Opinions. I hope you enjoy this. As always, if you have comments or questions, please feel free to, or corrections for that matter, please feel free to state so below in the comment section or message me. Let's begin. And first, probably the most important, and probably one of the most important works in written language, is the Odyssey by Homer. People contend that this isn't science fiction, but I contend it is, because everything in this story, according to the people at the time it was written, was plausible. You have to remember that science fiction doesn't describe what is scientifically accurate, but rather what is plausible. Okay, that separates it from general fantasy, because science fiction is a subset of fantasy. So, the difference between them is that, according to the people who were singing this myth, this song, and it started as a song, a very, very, very long song, which you would hear over many nights, everything that happened was possible. There wasn't anything that was beyond the scope of what was feasible, either theologically or scientifically or philosophically. So, the Odyssey definitely fits in this, and it's a straight-up adventure narrative told by an unreliable narrator, at least for the fun bits where he goes from island to island. It's all told by Odysseus, who doesn't actually have any verification except if his entire crew is dead, and he's spent this many years. And during that time, he encounters things that would be very much in keeping with what we would see when encountering alien planets, except these are islands, which was definitely more the case in the context. And it's all very fascinating and very good, and I highly recommend reading it. It's also the formation of one of the biggest tropes, some of the biggest tropes in Western literature, and it, along with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad, kind of form the three prongs which all Western literature rests on. So read it for that alone. Read it also because it's a good adventure story. And remember, the people at the time did not think of it as fantasy, although now, of course, we do. So, next one I want to talk about is The Tempest by Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Tempest is, I think, his best play. By far. It's also one of the very few original plays. It was inspired by an actual event, which was the discovery of Bermuda by the British, which was an isolated, uninhabited island in the middle of nowhere. And different stories were coming back and forth. Now, The Tempest is to a great extent a fantasy, but you have to remember, at the time, there still was a very strong similarity between what is scientific and what is fantastic. There is the beginnings of science. Roger Bacon, and St. Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic Church, and numerous Muslim scholars would all have started work on what was proto-science, but still, The Tempest, while fantastic, is definitely in the realm of science fiction, and would be the template for many science fiction stories and movies for a long time to come. And frankly, it's another extremely good read. I highly recommend it. There's a wonderfully beautiful version by Peter Greenaway called Prosperos Books. It's gorgeous. It's amazingly terrible in terms of pacing, so watch it on fast forward, but it's very beautiful, and it gives you a good sense of kind of the idea that he was getting across. This is similar in some ways to Christopher Marlowe's Faust. Same sort of character structure in terms of the scientist or magician who seeks too far. Bear in mind, again, alchemy would be considered as much a science as chemistry through the days of Sir Isaac Newton, who spent most of his time in the sciences studying alchemy. So, again, it's not exactly the fantasy you might think it was. It was kind of at the border. Let's move forward to the beginning of modern science fiction, which is probably one of the most influential books as well that you should absolutely have read, which is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is a lot of things. It is not a story about man tampering in God's domain, though. That's the spin that Victor, who's the villain of the piece, puts on it to excuse his behavior later towards Adam, his creation. I view it as a study in the pain of a young woman who's married to someone who doesn't really care for her and disdains her and her children in favor of adventure and exhilaration. Other people have different spins, but it's absolutely about parentage and the responsibilities of parentage. There'd be a later play, the one where we get the idea of robot as a word to describe it, and Frankenstein's monster, Adam, it really is one of the first robots in literature. The Golem of Prague predates it, and so do the various and sundry creatures created by Hephaestus in Greek myth and so on. And there were actual programmable robots in Byzantium in the 700s during the so-called Dark Ages. But I don't know how dark it could be if it had programmable robots. But Frankenstein's one of the first robots, and the play which gives us the term robot, Rossum's Universal Robots, also deals with parenthood and the duties of a creator to its creation. So you can look at it that way too. I do. Next, in the 19th century, probably, there's a whole host of science fiction which starts up in the 19th century. Edgar Allan Poe writes some, Ambrose Bierce writes some. Jules Verne famously wrote a lot of techno-thrillers, which we could see as science fiction, although they were really techno-thrillers because they were based on not speculative as much as extrapolating from what was known. I mean, they came across as science fiction. For example, the Nautilus in 20,000 Leagues was not technologically available at that time and wouldn't be until nuclear submarines were invented. The first one called the Nautilus, oddly enough, or intentionally. But the techno-thriller is more along what it is because it has that sort of thriller element to it, and the technology doesn't bring forth fundamental societal issues. Science fiction, when it is good, will bring forth the issues of the day or the past and examine them from a different lens. Verne's stuff doesn't do that to the same extent. It does it to somewhat, but not to the same extent as proper science fiction. Go ahead and read it. It's really fun. But the author who really started looking at science fiction as an analysis tool, the way that Shelley did on a grand scale, and who was extremely popular, was of course H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds, which is an excellent work. There have been multiple film versions, all of which have failed. My personal favorite's got to be Independence Day, but that's just because it recognizes that it's not going to work the way that the book is, so they take a divergent point and just run with it for the gee whiz yeehaw of it, and I like that. That's a good one, but I think better and more indicative of where science fiction would be going in the long run. War of the Worlds kind of inspires science fiction up through the 50s. Time Machine inspires science fiction from that point on, because it functions as, again, a commentary on the day it was written. And it's using a simple, implausible thing, which is time travel, which time travel forward is possible. Time travel back, not so much. You cause something known as causality violations, which I'm not going to go into here. But basically, you can time travel forward as much as you want. So he goes forward and forward and forward, and everything becomes more and more and more alien until he gets embroiled in a conflict between two sets of creatures and never realizes that they're sufficiently alien from him that he's not siding with humans against monsters, but with non-humans versus non-humans. And that's not even an accurate assessment. And I'm not going to give spoilers for a 125-year-old book. Why? I don't feel like it, but I think it's better if you come out this with your own. But even so, he goes further forward and comes to a world where there's nothing human remaining, which is probably accurate, because that will happen, and realizes how little all the struggle has been in the grand scheme of things. Not to say that the individual struggles aren't important, but that from a cosmic perspective or from a global perspective, they don't matter. So he goes back, relays this, and tries to save the people who he was siding with. Whether or not they deserve it is up for debate. And I think it's a really excellent read. I highly recommend it. I recommend all the books on this list, except for possibly the first book and the next, which is the Foundation Trilogy. The Foundation Trilogy does something very interesting. While there had been serials before that dealt with large empires and so on, the Foundation Trilogy created a sort of future history which was accessible to everyone, as well as a future impetus. It tried to bring social sciences into science fiction in a more methodical way. And this is very important because for a long time, and especially during the time when the Foundation Trilogy was being written, social sciences were denigrated as being useless and not hard and feminine, because God forbid. So for Asimov to write the Foundation Trilogy when he did and get it as popular as it was, and the first book is kind of a slog. I mean, Asimov never really was capable of writing dialogue, something he admitted on many different occasions. And he didn't really have an ear for female characters, which is probably one of the reasons why there aren't any of note in the first series, in the first book, which is actually just a series of short stories. But that gets better, especially towards the last half of Foundation and Empire and Second Foundation. So stick to it. It's really interesting. The miniseries on Apple TV, I think, is better than the books, but the miniseries has had the advantage of 70 years of advancement in the field and advancement in storytelling and advancement in science fiction. So I think that's why one of the reasons why it works better. It also has a great budget and excellent cast, so I recommend that. It's not the same as the books, but it's the same ideas are present. So recommend the Foundation Trilogy. This will become formative because everybody wants to do a future history now from that point on. I mean, people were doing future histories before, but really strongly future histories became important, which leads us to our next wonderful book, which I highly recommend, even though it is extremely homophobic. And so I'm warning you before you read it that it is extremely homophobic. There's like one gay guy and he's the villain. Dune. Dune's books 1 through 3, which were written together and were intended to be read as one large tome, are excellent books. The movie is amazing. Both movies are amazing for different reasons. I highly recommend watching them. Again, we get into the social sciences, political science, religion, economics as being the prime movers, which is what you'll see with more mature science fiction. It's not just we just discovered this neat thing, so let's explore what this neat thing does, but instead it's like, let's examine the human condition, let's examine how humans act in different ways. And you see the influence of Dune And you see the influence of Dune time and again throughout everything. Dune was self-informed by the Foundation Trilogy, so again, all these books build on each other, and I can't strongly emphasize enough how divergent Dune was relative to a lot of books at the time, and how much it changed things, especially since there was ecological science fiction beforehand, but it becomes really very much a concern going forward. Next is John Brunner's To Stand on Zanzibar, which is a book about, well, life as it is now, really. The man kind of called a lot of things. It's about population growth, it's about resource consumption, it's about spontaneous constant war, it's basically about what life was like in the 60s, 50s and 60s from the perspective of someone who wasn't cloistering himself just to the good news or just to the American perspective or so on. It's about the interconnectedness and globalization that was happening, had been happening since the beginnings of the Persian Empire back in, I don't know, like 7th century BC, but had been continuing on and had started accelerating with television and telephony, and the proto-internet, which Brunner discusses in this and The Sheep Look Up as kind of the basis of one of the early cyberpunk books, but also a book which explores a lot of modern issues, a lot of different ways. It's still very relevant. There are some dated things for obvious reasons, and I think that Brunner is well worth reading. He is a very good writer. Like Herbert, he can be quite beautiful, unlike Asimov, sadly. Next up, we have Lathe of Heaven. I think this is Ursula Le Guin's best work, and it kind of personifies the best parts of what came, which was the new wave of science fiction, which we're still dealing with, which is where we just kind of move away from all the nonsense imposed by the 30s, 40s, and 50s of masculine science fiction into a more holistic approach to humanity. Unlike Le Guin's other books, she and Heinlein, who are on opposite sides of the political spectrum very frequently, would have just ridiculous amounts of ludicrous politics that made no sense whatsoever, and were in some cases actively harmful, especially when it came to sexual relations. But Lathe of Heaven doesn't have that as much, and it's also her best book. It's the most tightly plotted and written of them. I highly recommend it. I think it's one of the few that stand up. There's a terrible but fun PBS movie about it, so if you can, you might want to see that. Just remember that it's just the worst, but in a good, fun way. Speaking of terrible movies, Solaris. We're in the books which you probably should read, but aren't seminal. Solaris by Stanislaw Lem, and everything by Stanislaw Lem, is a wonderful perspective on humanity when it comes across a god creature. Solaris itself isn't a god. I mean, it is something that we would consider a god in the old school mythological standpoint, and that Solaris is a world-spanning ocean which can change its environment and change the environment near it. It's a single organism which affects everything around it, and humanity's desperate attempts to understand it, which leads to humanity's desperate attempts to understand itself. Solaris has been made into 3 films. The first one is terrible, although everybody says it's great. It was done by the Russians. It's incredibly slow. Solaris is a short book. The movie is a long film. You can literally read the book in the time it takes to watch the movie. I know, because I've done it. Steven Soderbergh did a very good version with George Clooney, which I recommend. And for those of you who like cosmic horror, Event Horizon is pretty much Solaris. It's a terrible movie, but a fun one. So, if you like fun cosmic horror movies, Event Horizons are really good. And again, it's basically straight up Solaris. Read everything Lem wrote. I recommend doing so. But then I wrote my master's thesis on him, so, and Utopias. But another good choice is Jack Vance's Demon Princes, which is basically the Count of Monte Cristo, which you should absolutely read, but done in space. And I'm not going to go much beyond that, besides that there are 5 demon princes this man has to take vengeance upon, and he does in spectacular ways, and learns about himself in the process. Read everything Vance has written. The man is like Lem and Brunner, is a gorgeous writer, and it's just, you will learn better how to write and how to speak the English language better by reading Vance. To move forward along those lines, anything by Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe is probably the best writer in the English language I've ever encountered, except for possibly Shakespeare and that ilk. That's how good he is. He's one of those people who uses exactly the right word, and since English has something like 2 million words, your vocabulary will expand. But he also has amazing ideas. The first book which really broke through for him was Book of the Old Sun, which is a good place to start, but it's not the most accessible. The most accessible series is Book of the Long Sun, which takes place on a colony ship as it approaches, a generation colony ship as it approaches the the star and the planet it's supposed to settle on, which is followed by Book of the New Sun, which takes place there. I cannot overemphasize how gorgeous Wolfe's writing is. It can be hard to get through if you don't have a dictionary with you, but you should enjoy it once you get into the rhythm of it. It helps if you speak some Spanish, because he uses a lot of Spanish loan words. But anyways, so that's him. Now for some fun stuff. I mean, science fiction evolved and changed many times over the years, but mostly, I think, for the better. But there's still some, so what do we have with the rip-roaring stuff that was popular in the pulp years that wasn't as popular, or at least supposed to be as popular during the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, when things moved more introspective? Well, there still was some really good rip-roaring stuff produced then. I'd recommend C.J. Cherryh's Downbelow Station and subsequent series. They're fun. They're very quick reads. They're like distilled pulp in a very good way. And she's still a cranky old bat, bitching constantly on Facebook. So if you want to follow her feed, you can do that. And then there's Lois McMaster Bujold's For Corsican series, which starts with Shards of Honor. I highly recommend her. Again, this is kind of like distilled pulp, where they've taken all the things that we've learned from the new wave and the more lyrical science fiction, and integrated them into the rip-roaring adventure stories of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's a lot of other good people to work with, but this video is more than long enough. I highly recommend them. I mean, I haven't even mentioned Roger Zelazny's Amber series, which you should also read, or any number of other things. I'm going to stop myself now before I keep on going. But anyways, I hope this has been useful, and I hope the person at GalaxyCon who asked this question found this video to be useful. If you ever see it, this has been Ill-Informed Opinions. You can find me on YouTube and elsewhere online. My books are available at Amazon and any other books and mortar retailer. I hope to hear from you soon.